Hey Matt, thanks for joining us this evening. I know this will be a fun one. I know we're just laughing on the pre-show side of things, but this is going to be fun because you bring a wealth of knowledge to us. But also, I'm just excited to catch up and learn from you here today. So, thanks for coming on, man. I know this is going to be a fun show for everybody.
Yeah, man, I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to it. It's been a while since I've done one of these, so hopefully I can bring a little bit of something to the table.
Well, I think we dusted off the cobweb pre-show, so I think we'll be okay.
Yeah, perfect.
So to give some context to people, I know you're a rock star in what you do, but to give some context for the audience here, like what's your education background, and then what was your entry point into sports?
Yeah, so I did my DPT at Upstate Medical University in Syracuse, New York. Finished that back kind of 2014. Sports residency, so SCS into my OCS, and then a manual therapy fellowship from there. After completing all of that, I decided that I wanted to stay a student, so moved on, and I'm now working on my PhD in sports science with a focus on workload in the NBA. So, kind of throughout that, I got hooked up with North Carolina FC, the pro soccer team there, and the North Carolina Courage in Raleigh. Did 3 years with them, and then Steve Short and the Nuggets were kind enough to give me a chance there. Spent 5 years in Denver, and then a year with the New York Red Bulls, and now I'm here, full time PhD student.
Ooh, back to the student life. It's funny. I picked it up. You said workload, but I know the mainstream media likes to call it load management. So we'll
Uh,
we'll we'll,
yeah,
we'll
we
decipher
can
through it later.
unpack that.
We will certainly unpack that one. But one thing, I think you're the first guest I've had on the show that actually went through the manual therapy fellowship. So you just touch on that. One, I'm just curious how that was for you.
Yeah, I would say that was like PT school for me was not maybe the best experience. It was a kind of a more neuro driven, acute care inpatient type program. There was good ortho there for sure, but it wasn't. I came into PT knowing I wanted to work in sports med, that I wanted to be in the NBA specifically. And so in sports residency was cool, but it felt like it was just a lot of reading research and preparing for the test. And fellowship was like the moment that we could really unpack that. Like, hey, you've got all this knowledge, but now we have to figure out how to actually apply it to the patient and do really great evals and really great treatment sessions. And I thought, I'm going to learn all these skills. I'm going to have these great hands. And all of that was true. The amount of get back to the basics and do the basics well was incredible. You spent time recording initial evals with patients and then submitting them for people to watch, which is a bit challenging to watch yourself go back and do an eval on camera, but then they also uh, wrote out every word you said and every word the patient said for the entire eval, and then would put comments in the Word doc of like, well, why didn't you say this or why did you say that? So it was a humbling experience, and I'm definitely a better provider for it.
That's pretty fascinating that they had you submit the videos and then you got that. I imagine that was incredibly nerve wracking to watch yourself, but also at the same time, probably one of your greatest teachers that you've had in your career of just like, oh, let me watch myself in the mirror and just see
Yeah.
things that you probably didn't even realize you did or had ticks or words that
Hmm.
you say that you don't even know. It's always fascinating when you watch yourself on the video. So, I mean, credit to you for going through that. It's impressive. And thanks for sharing the perspective on that.
Yeah, it was worth every bit. I recommend it to everybody, but you got to be mentally prepared for a humbling experience over a few years, especially if you go through EIM's program.
Wonderful. And then you went from, early in your career, it was soccer, and went to basketball, went back to soccer. So NBA, MLS. Did I hear NWSL in there too?
Yeah, NWSL when I was in Raleigh, so have stretched across three pro sports leagues now.
Okay, right on. So we share a very similar background, MLS, NWSL, and NBA too. I didn't know the NWSL. I knew the MLS side. Okay, cool.
Yeah,
Within each of those leagues, right? There's always pros, cons, plus, minuses, things you like, things that separate the leagues from the other. I always think it's a fun question to ask those that have worked in different leagues. So from your perspective, NBA, NWSL, MLS, what were some of the things you liked most about working in each league?
yeah, it's almost like the uh, between the NBA and MLS, they're a bit polar opposites as far as game demand, and I think I really appreciate both ends of that spectrum. Like, I think it's fascinating. Why I will hopefully go back into the NBA at some point is I think that's the most fascinating balance of athletes, of trying to deal with these tendon dominant athletes who are playing 3.5 games a week, flying hundreds, if not thousands of miles between games, and keeping them healthy and also progressing athletic development across the course of the season. Fascinating challenge to deal with we can touch on it. Not a lot of great answers. I'm sure we'll get there. But in soccer, it's interesting because you can really apply the research that's been done. There's a lot of research out there in soccer. It's a very set, organized schedule. Your busy week is a Wednesday and a Saturday, but you have a decent idea through the literature of how do I scheme out a -1, a -2, a -3? What are we doing on our recovery days and why? So you can really periodize everything from what they're doing in the training room to the gym to even their recovery modalities based on what you know about the physiology and the time you have between games. So they're two opposite ends of the spectrum, but there's really good things to enjoy about both leagues.
Was there anything culturally different that I think every sport and every league has their own culture to it. So, like culturally speaking, what similarities or differences did you notice across the leagues?
Yeah, definitely cultural differences between the two leagues. It was, the international flavor in professional soccer is massive. So it's just this, and there's some of that in the NBA, but there was times in the training room in MLS that there was no English being spoken, that it was strictly Spanish and Portuguese. So that creates an interesting dynamic in trying to communicate with players and work through translators at times. Creates this kind of interesting cultural wrinkle and being conscious of like the way they grew up or their eating habits, or if they are trying to support family in another country while they're here. It's a really interesting dynamic there. And then the NBA is always going to be different from other sports leagues because of how much the players own, right? The players being 50% of the league and having that much power and control through the collective bargaining agreement is the best and the worst thing that happens to the league. It's awesome for player empowerment for them to be dialed in and understand what's going on. And at the same time, it can create real challenges when contract situations are interrupting kind of what we're trying to do for athletes or what is best for the athletes. I would say those are the two kind of biggest cultural differences between the two leagues.
I definitely missed the international flair and spice that the soccer locker room had. There's just something fun about it, right? You just had this melting pot of cultures and personalities, and even the language. It's cool to just hear like other people having conversations in different languages. Whether or not they're talking about you or not, we'll never know. But the reality the reality is it's a pretty cool and fun environment to be a part of. So I'm envious of you having experienced that recently, because I do miss that. One thing I heard you say, from a challenge perspective was the good and the bad thing. Not a good and the bad thing. Strength, weakness, call it what we may. CBA and the NBA in comparison to let's just call it the CBA and player empowerment in the MLS. Could you expand upon that? Because I think that's something that does separate the NBA from a lot of other leagues. Can you expound upon that to give context to what that actually means? Because inevitably it affects us at what we can do at our job, or not necessarily affects. I think that's the wrong word. It influences us on our day to day. So could you expound upon how the CBA and the NBA influences how we're able to be successful at our job?
Yeah, and I think to clarify on this is I think the NBA is my favorite league in the world, and I think it's 100% more a positive than a negative that there is player empowerment, because they end up being more involved in the decision-making process around them. And because of, say, the guaranteed structure standpoint, they are not afraid to say, hey, I don't feel good. And they can say it to me, and they'll say it to you, and then they'll say it to the coach in the front office. Like, it creates this little bit more consistency of, this is how I feel and this is what's going on, because there's this safety net of protection for them. And I think to be really good in sports medicine, sports performance, open and honest communication is essential. So I think that level of empowerment in the NBA is good. The challenge that it influences us is players know they have that power. And I think at times I don't want to say you like get concerned. I want to make sure that I frame it correctly, that guys kind of stretch a little bit to external consults maybe too soon, or reaching out to personal guys too soon. And there's a lot of really good external consultants around the NBA. There's a lot of really good external companies that work with NBA players. but we've all seen kind of the shady one, the snake oil salesman that sells a guy something that's counter to what the team is saying and what a lot of heavily vetted, educated professionals are trying to do to help the player in the best way possible. So I hope I navigated that without like sounding crazy. But yeah, it's an interesting world.
No, you did a great job expanding on it. And I think what the phrase that, I don't say I think, I know the phrase that came to mind is the grass is greener elsewhere, right? I also recognize that if I was a professional athlete, I would want to make sure I have my own support group externally, because the nature of professional sports across all leagues is you're not seeing many athletes stay with one team for so long. And so because of that, I take the perspective of, I welcome those external consults or external opinions, because the reality is they're probably in that player's camp for a reason. And I think if they trust them, then there's got to be that factor of acknowledging that. And to your point of, snake oil salesman, wow, tongue twister there. Snake oil salesman. I think those are few and far between. I think we've gotten better as a whole as a society that it's really hard to not know your stuff this day and age. And even my experience now, well, not now, most recently over the years, is just with the overload of information and data. Generally speaking, players are more educated now than they were 10 years ago. So with that, when they're asking questions or they're inviting others to be a part of the conversation, there's usually a reason why. I respect the need to, or the desire to want to consult those individuals.
Yeah, and I'm on the external consultant side now with a group, so I am not. I am the guy I'm talking about being brought in separate from the team. But I do think that there's a really good way, and like you said, I think players are so much more educated now, and I think again, the more education that we can give to players, the more empowerment we can give to players, because we are working in a servant role to them to help them be successful. I think all of that is a positive.
Wonderful. I agree with
Yeah.
you. The one thing I was kind of teasing out as you were talking about kind of decision making or utilizing the consults, I imagine there's some like pressure and emotions that get involved in this environment when you start having multiple people and multiple opinions, for better or for worse, right? Inevitably, that is part of the equation. Like, how do you, in the world of professional sports, how do you manage the high stakes pressure and the emotional toll that is a part of this environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in the event that, like the player cases that we're talking about, and there's a lot of opinions being around, I think getting people, as hard as it is, right, to get a GM, a coach, the player themselves, their personal PT or their personal strength coach, and then somebody like a staff performance representative in a room. I think getting in a room together and flushing those ideas out, especially post COVID, right, with Zoom being so common, it's easy to be like, hey, let's all get on a call. We can see face to face each other's reactions and what's going on and come up with the best idea for the player. I think that helps to manage it. Now, as far as managing the stressors and the highs and lows of pro sports, man, what a question. For me, I think maintaining balance throughout all of this is so important. It's on. It's most important for the players and the coaches' wins and losses. And I think going across the NBA season, and I know you've experienced this, if you try and ride the highs and lows of every win and loss, you're going to burn yourself out really fast. So trying to dissociate a little bit from the acuity of every game result. Obviously, we all want to win, right? Like I want to win every game, but that's just not reality in the NBA. So when the team's down, being just like a half step more positive on everything, you don't want to come in and be the guy that's like overjoyed after a loss. That doesn't ring super well in the locker room. But if you're a little bit happier, hey, we're going to get it. It's a back to back. Let's get the next one, right? Little stuff to stay positive. And then on the same end, reminding yourself on the big emotional highs, the amazing moments. Oh, we won a big game in the regular season. It's like, hey, it's one out of every 80, it's 182. They all count the same. We got to go get the next one too. Like, nobody cares about what we did on Tuesday when it gets to Friday. Let's go get that Thursday game now. So I think trying to maintain a little bit bigger picture perspective in that space helps to balance some of the emotions, and recognizing we work in pro sports, man. Like, this is you and I are both very lucky to have the experiences we've had and to be able to work with the people we do. So just keeping that little bit of perspective in the back of your mind.
Yes, the perspective is everything because the it's very easy to get lost in the weeds and the emotional
Mm-hmm.
downs and the emotional highs. So I'd love to hear you say that keeping the bigger perspective and ultimately, yeah, you're right. But the emotions and the pressures are just the nature of winning and losing a game because that's probably like the greatest thing about sports, right? It's just like an analogy for life. I think we hear a lot of people say is
Yeah.
highs and lows. Same thing happen in life. Just the reality is sports gives you that instantaneous feedback if you had success or failure because did you
Yeah.
win the game or not? And when you play every other day or 3 and 5 nights, right? You're just constantly reminded of you're doing good, you're not doing good. You get that box score. Ooh, I did great. Ooh, I didn't do great. Oh, I missed the game because I was hurt. Oh, I'm doing bad. Oh, I got back early. Oh, I'm doing great. Right? You just constantly have this instantaneous feedback that just
Yeah.
feeds into, and that's just the nature of the environment, which is so cool, but also so frustrating at the same time.
Yeah. It'll wear you down if you ride those highs and lows with players. And I think you mentioned like the instantaneous feedback. I think recognizing the demand that is on a player, like a player has a bad game and Twitter's on fire, right? Instagram's on fire, ESPN's on fire, lighting this player up. And they turn around and go for 30 and 10 the next game, and they're the best thing in the world. So just like trying to be that little bit of balance for them. And I'd be remiss not to mention for staff in this space when the pressures are getting high and low is to recognize that like your career is like separating yourself from your career a little bit, like don't not getting so attached to the logo on your chest that is everything, but staying grounded outside of the game I think is important as well.
I, I share that same sentiment. I definitely will say early in my career in pro sports, like you were tied to this job, like that was your identity. And then that's just most people in life when they come in their early 20s, like you really have pretty much your career, this thing you've been working on to for these last 4 years, 6 years, 8 years, whatever it was at college, like your career becomes your identity. And to that point, that just feeds into the stressors. If that's the main focus every day, man, like that's hard to dissociate from. And I think I hope as we grow in this space, and I certainly have, and it sounds like you have too, that you learn to create those boundaries, find those habits, those routines, those things that also bring you joy outside of being tied to, hey, I'm Matt and I work for this team, or hey, Adam, I work for this team. I think that's huge importance, and I think that's probably what keeps people successful in this space more than others.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I think I'm comfortable enough now in my life going out on a limb. Like my time with Red Bull didn't end in the way that I would have liked it to, and it's the nature of pro sports. But I can say very honestly that I went through a real struggle immediately following that. Of like, well, I've spent 9 years of my life doing this. I've spent X amount of money, X amount of time on degrees, continuing ed, time in players, time in staff, time in coaches. Like really dedicating so much of my life to it, and now having a little bit of time to step back and recognize like, all right, where do I truly find value? What is my identity for myself, and my family and my son and my dogs, and yeah, it's given me a healthy perspective on life now, and I really appreciate it. I'll be better off when I go back into a full-time team gig.
I'm going to throw a question off script here. I'm really curious on your take, and this is just a random thought I had as you were saying that. Is there's that expression of like lifers that are in this space for a long time. Do you think there's that level of fear of not knowing what to do with yourself or filling that void, like you just said? Like you came out of sports, and the first thing I heard you say was like, "Whoa, what do I do with myself?" Because of the time commitment or the emotional attachments. Do you think? I don't even know how to ask this question other than I heard that, and I want to say, do you think that is something that exists, or is that something you just experienced?
Yes, I do. I joke with my wife like if I wasn't in pro sports, I don't know what I'd do. But I do think there's a component that I described it to a friend of mine as like the NBA and pro sports is like a drug, right? Like you get hooked on it, and
Mm.
it's the planes, it's the hotels, it's the lights, the music, like it's this massive hit for your nervous system all the time, right? And like you said, you're riding these highs and lows and ups and downs, and you're getting these experiences that you'd never get elsewhere. And that's all well and good, but I really do think, for me personally, we're getting off script and a little deep here, so I hope the listeners appreciate it, right? But I don't want to get to the end of this run of life and have friends and family be like, he was a great sports scientist in the NBA, or he was a great PT, right? I want my friends and family to remember he's a great husband, he's a great father, he's a great friend. So I hope to do this for a really long time, and I think figuring out how to balance those two things in a healthier way going forward is essential to being able to do this as a lifer. And then if the time comes that I feel like I'm ready to step away, I can. So always having kind of plans B, C in place as well.
When you find the secret sauce for that recipe of balance in this space, please let me know.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm going to have it, but it's easy to say right now as a full-time student with a lot of time to self-reflect and think.
I love to hear that, though. One fun question I want to ask and wrap up kind of the discussion on leagues and time and kind of the fun stuff of sports is, NBA arenas and MLS stadiums. Did you have a favorite arena and or stadium from each league?
Yeah, the first one that comes to mind in MLS is LAFC. Their supporters section is absolutely raucous in like borderline nothing I've ever experienced. I mean, they were so much fun. We played them on an ABC game at like whatever, a mid-afternoon on a Sunday. It was hot, but they were lighting the flares, chanting. It's a whole quarter of the stadium. I mean, it was really a fun experience. Didn't win the game, which was unfortunate, but when I think of fun places to visit, a really good hostile environment is it. As far as NBA stuff, I mean, I've been back to Denver a couple of times since, and that just feels like home to me. So it's kind of a cop-out answer, but I'm still really close with a lot of people there, staff, front office players. So it's nice to go back and see people and feel comfortable in an arena.
I mean, I would imagine there's a emotional connection that you probably didn't realize was palpable until you walked back in there from leaving that space.
Yeah, for sure. I think as we talk about like the emotional side of kind of the life in sport, my first visit back was like, oh wow, this is like, it's like walking back into your parents' house almost. Like it's like there's this old familiar feeling of the space. You have kind of this rush of memories, and there's so many good memories from Denver in that arena.
Yeah, it's a great city too. I love that city. It's
Yeah,
one of my top
it's
5
a
cities.
great city.
All right, let's pivot here, and I really want to learn a little bit from you here, and I know our audience does too. And the topic of discussion that, and we can take this wherever you want to go because I know you're passionate about it, you're learning about it. I heard you say workload, which I think workload is probably more the phrase that's maybe used in other sports, but definitely in the NBA, you hear it bastardized all the time. Load management, right? We get a lot of the media experts talking about superstars resting and players not playing, and deciding, hey, is it really meaningful or not? So I just want to hit pause real quick and ask you this question: how do you define load management?
Man, you said bastardized, and it makes me feel better about like maybe slipping up with a curse word here or there on the podcast. I think it's absolutely turned into a trash can for anything workload related in the media. And I think this is one that has been spun into, well, staffs are trying to hold players out of games, whatever. And I think every one of those decisions of whether or not a player is playing or not on any given night is so much more complex than just to say, it's a load management issue. But they get the box score and they read, return to play workload management, and they run with it. And obviously all of what you and I and the listeners understand around like tendon issues and how you handle those things, like the Kawhi situation seemed to be the one that really bubbled a lot of this to the forefront years ago. So off of my soapbox on that, I definitely view it differently. I look at it more as a term that kind of encompasses periodization, training programs, in athlete monitoring, and kind of all of those things coming into a topic called workload, and then recognizing all the different facets of that, right? There's internal workload, there's external workload, there's ways that we monitor response to workload, whether that be like a subjective questionnaire, what does recovery look like? So I think workload can mean a lot more than just, oh, well, we're just trying to hold the guy out of the game. I think in the future, as we move forward with this stuff and have a better understanding around this space, the goal should be using this to where can we push players and why, and in return to play spaces, maybe being slightly more accurate with our recommendations of when players are ready to return to the court or to the field.
Is workload and stress the same thing, or are they different?
Oh boy. Wow. What a great question. Different, I would say.
How so?
Maybe that's a personal bias, right? I look at workload as a very kind of high performance sports science. We're tracking external load, accelerations, top speed, total distance, and then whichever internal workload metrics you feel like tracking at the time. I think those are components of stress, but like I can't effectively understand psychological stress or familial stress. Like I'm not a psychologist. I do not pretend to be one. It's like I leave that to the experts. But I think there's other facets of stress, right? There's financial stress that I can't that totally affects the athlete and their performance and probably affects their risk because of the nervous system. But I can't quantify what their financial stress is or their family stress is. So I would say they're different, but maybe it's just because of how I'm defining them.
I would agree. I would agree that to the things that you said, you can't necessarily measure everything that's stressful. Everyone's
Yeah.
personal and emotional experiences are different. Things outside of things that you don't even see, things that they think about, way certain stimuli have hit people differently than other stimuli. So I think stress to me is definitely different than workload, because workload is you try to measure the physical work. Not to take a word out of its own name, but you're
Yeah.
trying to measure what you're actually doing. And I love to hear you say that you're looking at it internally and externally, because both of those are both valuable, but also different at the same time. So if we expound upon that idea, when you talk about internal workload versus external workload, how are they, how do I want to ask this question? How are they affecting one another, but how are they also their own entity at the same time?
Yeah. So I'll start with external workload because I think it's the easier one to understand, right? Like we're just looking at, to me, the common way to do it is, well, what did the athlete do? And I look at it maybe differently of what are the stressors that the athlete underwent. So yes, they ran 3 miles, but they also accumulated 3 miles of demand on their body. Or their max speed was, 16 miles per hour on a sprint. And again, I got to use sprint very differently in soccer and basketball because the speed, as you know, the speeds are like, and we can get to that when we talk about my PhD work a little bit more. So looking at external workload in that space of like, well, what did the athlete undergo during their time on the floor, their time on the field? Internal workload is the response to those stressors to me. The easy one here is heart rate. I think tracking heart rate is really, really hard, and the data is. I don't know if you guys have messed with it in Phoenix at all. I've spent several years messing with it in Denver and never really found it to. I didn't think the data was clean enough to use it, but how it relates is it's like, well, if I produced these external workload numbers, distance, accelerations, decelerations, whatever, and they're the exact same on day one and day two, looking towards internal measures as a way to say, how did the body respond? One day was the heart rate 120 for the session, and then the next day it's 165 for the same session. Like that gives us an idea potentially on how the body's responding to the stress that it underwent. And I think all of this fits into a really holistic athlete monitoring program, right? Where it's like a subjective questionnaire, an internal measure that the athlete isn't, self-reporting, external workload measure, and then tracking recovery modalities around it to get this big picture of athlete monitoring. So like you said, I think they do relate, but there's clearly a differentiation between what fits in external and what fits in internal workload.
I hear your struggles on the heart rate side of things. I view heart rate as one of those ones you're curious about, but maybe we are still struggling to figure out how it's best utilized in a
Yeah.
complex, chaotic environment like sport. Now, what I
Mhm.
heard you say is, hey, if I ran the same session on 2 separate days and my heart rate had 2 different responses, that's worth investigating. And where experiences that I had going back to soccer, one thing we did as part of a monitoring tool, and I don't know if teams are still doing this in the soccer world, but the yo-yo intermittent recovery 2 test, we'd run a portion
Mhm.
of that because you
Yep.
create your constant external workload. So you run for 5-6 minutes at a graded exposure of speed, and then you athletes stand still for 2 to 3 minutes. You see what their peak heart rate was, and then you see what their recovery was. And because you kept the external workload the same, I felt, and I think the research suggests, you could trust the heart rate response not only during it, but then also to your point of when your time in basketball, were you able to find validation within the heart rate? I struggle too. I think where my mind goes is I'm looking for exposures to basically zone 5. I think you want to make sure they're still touching max
Mhm.
heart rate exposures
Yeah.
because you play 7 games in 12 days and you're a bottom rotation guy or bottom roster guy, you're not getting much burn. You could go 12 days with not really touching anything intensive. And I think the intensive qualities drop first before extensive qualities do. So to circle up on the idea where you were having your heart rate struggles, that's where I've kind of come full circle to my current experiences of how do you use it because it's important, but also recognize that maybe not all of it is as valuable in other scenarios as we'd like them to be.
For sure. And we did a heart rate recovery the best we could on 1 game weeks when I was with New York Red Bull. And I think we ran into like the biggest challenge I ran into in that space is, we'd start in February in New Jersey, and then you get to
Oh,
July. And so you run into like, yeah, the session is the same, but the environmental factors are totally different, whether heat, humidity, wind. Um, so, and then you're like, well, we would expect heart rate to change and it better change in response to, temperature and humidity. So it became really hard to like, what are we getting out of this and why? And then obviously my example, it's like, well, this sounds really nice, but no session's ever the same. The game is so chaotic and so crazy. I spent a good bit of time in Denver doing SRP as we could argue, and there are clear arguments around, is this an internal workload measure? Is this a subjective measure? But we did a decent bit of tracking it and kept compliance high for several years. The challenge is that, you know, NBA guys at times are, because they have so many pulls on them, the coach, the GM, me, like they just get sick of me asking them the question. And so you're not sure at some point if this is going to be the most accurate response, or if they're just like, hey, I'm shooting free throws. It was a 5 out of 10. I'll see you later. And like, respect, you got way more on your plate than I do. But when you're trying to do good science, it gets a little bit tricky.
yeah. It's the complex chaos of sports is enticing. It'd always be curious. It's also a double-edged
Yeah.
sword and the most challenging part of what we try to do when you're looking for answers and you're looking for concrete processes or systems. You're like, well, hey, we did this last time. Shouldn't it work this time? Maybe not. And
Maybe.
like I said, I love the analogy of running a heart rate recovery test in February in New Jersey versus August in the dead of summer where it's humid and you step outside and this is disgusting, right? Grew up in New England. I know that vibe. I don't miss it. Not
Don't
envious of
miss
it,
it at all.
but I know exactly what you're talking about. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
To piggyback on this idea of technology and internal external load, are there any? Actually, let me pause and ask this question first. How can technology and data support the concepts that you mentioned earlier about load management?
Yeah. So I think, like, if we stick to the NBA, right? Years ago, boy, like 2014, 15, 16, teams were messing around with catapult and with using accelerometers in the NBA. Now, again, when we touch on the PhD stuff, we can talk a little bit more about where the research is on this stuff. But teams were messing around with catapult and they were trying to track stuff, but it's just not a very it's an accurate way to capture accelerations and decelerations, but I don't think it's an accurate way to provide a full representation of what happened on the floor that day. So the expansion of ultra wideband LPS has been huge. The integration of that into the NBA's second spectrum data, also huge for doing our best. Now, they're not the same systems, and camera height matters or sensor height matters as far as data degradation. So it's not perfect, but it's better. The NBA moving towards Hawkeye to be another kind of workload capture system around games, that's going to be an asset for teams to use moving forward. So I think all of that has been supportive of gathering more data. I think we're getting to the point, if we haven't already exceeded it in the NBA, we have a just absolute shitload of data and we don't really know what any of it means. So that's a challenge, or especially on our end, right? When you capture, hey, we're doing this many jump tests, we're doing this many strength tests, we've got all this game data, we've asked all these questions, and to relate it back to your questions, like, well, we have all this data. That's great. I'm a super big fan of like, keep it simple, stupid, because I don't think I'm the smartest guy out there. And I try and relate everything back to like, who is the audience that I'm delivering it to? So we can make cool, sexy dashboards that you and I can talk about it, one standard deviation versus two off the norms. Is our data set big enough? Like, who doesn't give a shit about that? Front office coaches and players. Like, we have to, as a group, as a community, recognize like where we fit into a team setting, and that we are not the overarching group. It is players, coaches, and front office are the overarching group, and we are supportive of that. So I think keeping stuff really simple, very digestible, and ultimately actionable. I can have tons of data and make really sexy dashboards. If it doesn't help the team win, it doesn't matter. Off my soapbox.
Such a valid point, though, because it's a results driven business. It's not a process driven business. As much as you and I may be process oriented, systems oriented, as much as it goes against the grain of what like is at our core, the reality is sometimes the process gets overridden by the result. And that is the nature, I think, of any business where you're results driven, and that's what you're trying to do. We could probably argue that's probably the case for most businesses. You're trying to get results, but it's certainly at a much higher stake when you're reminded of wins and losses day in and day out.
For sure. And other companies look at it as just like P&L sheets, right? It's like, am I operating in the red or the black, right? There's still a result orientation to this. Like, you can have the best process in the world. If your product stinks, nobody's going to buy it. So I view it like that. Like, I can have all the data in the world, but like, if it doesn't help the coach make a decision, if it doesn't help the player development coach understand what they can push in this individual training session, if it doesn't help the front office make a decision on whether or not we're drafting a player, like, there's obviously more questions than that, but those are really big questions that we want to make sure we're supportive, because that's most important to those stakeholders.
1,000%. You referred to it a few times already, so I just want to jump 2 feet into this and touch upon where you're at in your work at the PhD, because I think it's very relevant to the topic of load management in the world of rehab and training. So really don't have a specific question for you other than my curiosity is piqued as you referred to your PhD and your work you're doing there. So what is the basis of the PhD and what have you learned so far?
Yeah, so I'm doing for those not familiar, like stateside listeners that aren't familiar with how PhDs work in other areas, like, I'm doing a PhD in Australia, so it's a PhD by publication. So my goal is to publish 2 reviews, 3 original articles, write opening and closing chapters, and in the sense of and that'll serve as my dissertation. So to this point, I've submitted one paper to Sports Med, and that was the one I was kind of alluding to, that with the micro sensors and the distance and the speed stuff that we don't really know. That paper looked at all external workload data from time motion analysis, microsensors, and LPS that's been published in competitive basketball, and pulled out intensity zone classifications from each paper. So how are we defining standing still? In the time motion analysis research, It's not even consistent how we define standing still. Like some of them said it was 0 meters per second. Some of them said it was 0 to 1 meter per second. Now, it doesn't seem like a really big deal, but that's not great science when you're comparing papers. And then on the opposite end of that is like, what are we considering high speed running and sprinting? Because we understand, to your point about like time in red zone, like time near peak speed or over 90% exposures definitely has an impact. That looks different on a basketball court than it does on a soccer field or soccer pitch, whatever. The challenge that we found through the systematic review is that a lot of this research is based on field sports and is based on GPS data. So we've got all these basketball studies kind of pumping out research and saying these are our intensity zone classifications, but without any real unification of what we're doing. The other challenge that we didn't investigate right on in that paper, but is something to be investigated further in the future, is a lot of these intensity zones are the same across men and women and the same across competition levels, which again, we understand that like an AAU player is going to move different than an NBA player, is going to move different than a WNBA player, and the force that they can output is very different. So that was the first paper. I think the biggest learning from that, and again, hoping that we get approval for that. We're waiting on our response for anybody that's gone through the publication process. I think that those are kind of the big learnings there, is that we've got a long way to go. We don't know as much as we think we do. We don't have a ton of evidence in basketball. And then if you get even more granular with that, we have even less evidence specific to NBA players. And these guys are definitely built different than a EuroLeague player, than a NBL player. So that's the big learning from the first one. We're going to do a scoping review on some NBA stuff for the second one. And then the 3 original papers are on in-game workload from the NBA, looking at the last 5 years of second spectrum data. So over the last couple of years, I've been back and forth with the NBA working on a research proposal that will be beneficial to the scientific community and also protecting players in the league and any sensitive information. So once we get our hands on that data and we're able to move forward, we'll run 3 different papers on that, looking at different workloads over time. I don't necessarily want to use acute and chronic windows because I know that some people are getting the shivers about acute to chronic workload. It's not necessarily that. It's that like you have a general idea of what it looks like for a Phoenix Sun player to play 3 games in a week and what the cumulative load is over that. That's really cool, but you only have, 17 data points, including your 2-way players a year. And a good chunk of those guys, to your point, aren't getting enough burn on a regular basis to be a valuable data point. We need bigger, I don't want to say big data, bigger data than that to understand normative data before we can understand abnormal. So looking at what is normal across a 2-game week, a 3-game week, a 4-game week, a 5-game week, can we overlay travel on that? Can we lay game statistics on that? And then start finding out what normal is for these short windows, maybe quarterly, maybe season long, year to year kind of variation. Is the game changing over time? Those questions allow us to start branching into what's abnormal. But we got to have a big picture of what we're actually dealing with first.
So many thoughts I have for you.
I don't have any answers, man.
First one, I'm just gonna be devil's advocate to kind of where the last statement went, where as far as like looking at travel, looking at quarterly, looking at there's so many variables. Mm-hmm. Is it too complex where you're not going to be able to get to that space? And the reason I ask that is the first thing that comes to mind is I know how challenging it can be when you're just trying to compare season to season with just roster turnover. And then when you have roster turnover or coaching turnover, playing style of play changes, opponent's style of play changes. So it's very challenging. I wonder, can we get to that space? And I'm hopeful that we can. I am being practical here and saying, man, there's a lot of complex factors that you just layered into there. I am just really curious your take on how do we get to where your vision is.
This could be a flaming disaster. And I will say that there. Like, this may not produce anything valuable. And that's kind of the risk you take when you're doing original research. I think I'm optimistic that because our sample size is going to be so big, it's going to be every player that's touched an NBA floor during a 5-year window for every single game. That, yeah, we may just get some normative data out of it, but I think that's fine because I think it'll give practitioners at that point, like, your job is to then say, okay, here's what's normal, but we play a Mike D'Antoni style, 7-second offense. So we understand that these metrics are going to change for us. And so we can factor that in, right? Or, hey, we're getting to the playoffs, number of possessions is going to change. What do we expect that to do to workload? And then does it happen? So if nothing else, I think it's just going to provide a really solid data sample for people to then layer in their own personal factors. And like, individual players are going to be vastly different from the norms, right? I think we look at it and how guys move too. Like, there's no normal movement per se, but you can be like, that's a tendon dominant, stiff dude versus like that guy's Gumby over there and he's very muscle dominant and he's going to move differently. So I think just like finding the middle on this data and defining what we're dealing with. There was a paper, oh boy, several years ago. I don't want to butcher his name. Caparros, 2016, 2017, did an external workload paper on the NBA, but it was a small data sample set. Tried to relate it to injury. I think like as soon as you layer injury in on anything, this shit gets impossible. To your point that it's like a factor that we don't understand injury well enough. We can't relate it to workload, which we also don't understand well enough. So a lot of support for him taking the dive into that. But I think it reminded me of like, in good science, let's find out what normal is and go from there.
Yes. Yes to everything. Like with all of that, there's one question I want to get to walk away with this, right? Like, what have we gotten right and what have we gotten wrong about this idea of load management?
Yeah. In some conversations over the last week, I can totally point to what we've gotten wrong and where it leaves me cautious going forward with like the NBA in this Hawkeye deal. We, not necessarily you and I, us as a community, us as the NBA, I think got irresponsible early on with the workload data and thinking it was telling us more than what it was. Like, oh, this player's definitely deteriorating. To your point, there's so many external factors that go into that like his workload could be changed for a myriad of reasons: coaching change, individual player development change, lifestyle changes. Like, and it doesn't necessarily, without knowing what normal is, we can't say that that directly correlates to their outcomes on the floor as a player. So I think when it was introduced, people got really excited about it. The pendulum swings really far. We want to use all this data. Like you said, you and I get really excited about this stuff. So we want to tell everybody about things we're excited about. And then it kind of backfires to be like, oh, we don't know that much. And then coaches are like, hey, he can play 17 to 20 minutes. What's the difference between 20 minutes and 21 minutes? Like, damn, good point, coach. Not much, right? But there's a big difference between 17 and 34 minutes. So I think that's probably what we've gotten wrong with this stuff. It's always nice when you get really excited about a topic to have this kind of like sense checker, realistic, outside voice, like a coach or a player, to be like, you really think that matters? And you're like, God, I'm lost in the weeds. Good point. Now, what have we done well with it? I think we're doing a lot better, to a point you made earlier in the podcast about collecting data and appreciating that this is an important part of sport. That there is an opportunity to do really good science and support our decision makings with science and create action that is based in evidence, both like hard data, anecdotal evidence, like good EBP, best available published evidence. It's all the stakeholders' inputs. Like, I think we are at a point now where we've got so many good staffs in the NBA, and I say that like so, grinning ear to ear, that like there's good providers in the NBA right now. I have a lot of respect for the people in the league and what they're doing. That this group now is trying to push forward to a more evidence-based system. So I think that's probably what we've done best around the workload, and workload being just like a subset of sports science, but in this sports science space in the NBA.
I think a product of that too is the technology has caught up to it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I think we've worked out the kinks of, like you were saying early on, maybe 10 years ago. Sheesh. I mean, when I was in MLS, I don't know if you've ever heard of it. We were using Adidas My Coach. That's a whole.
Yeah.
Anyone that knows that, you can just nodding your head and smiling if you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you don't, just Google it and you'll just see this massive lime green box that weighed, God knows, 80 pounds, and you had to carry it everywhere. But anyways, off my soapbox there. I share that with you, like to your point of not only are the practitioners getting better, right? I think that's just a product of society. Like access to information and education is making everybody better. Now, being a gatekeeper of what information is meaningful or not, that's a whole nother conversation and struggle that we all face. But to your point, one thing that stands out to me is that the technological advances and accuracy of what we are measuring and understanding how that measurement or how that KPI, key performance indicator, influences performance, we're getting there simply from the mere fact we've had so many failures and mistakes in the past that we're just slowly starting to learn. Actually, you know what? This is kind of meaningful. Just like I think, you think back to general strength and conditioning principles, like you probably just need to get strong, really, really strong as like your first principle of human performance. And after that, then chase speed and power. But you skip that step, you're probably not going to do well in the long run. Yeah, so they're right there. Tagline, right? Get a shirt, put it on your forehead, whatever you got to do. So I want to share that same sentiment with you, that I think we are getting there. And you're right, there are some very creative, smart-minded folks, not only in this league, but other leagues too. I mean, there's definitely, we're growing because society is just putting a value on technology and data. I mean, just look at the last, what it is, we're 2023 right now. Just look at the last 12 to 18 months where artificial intelligence and machine learning has taken a lot of different consumer products. Like if that's consumer products, you can only imagine what's happening behind closed doors, right? So I think we're going on the right trajectory, and I'm happy to hear you say that. And I just hope one, it's not a complete disaster on your end. And I hope also in those living in the space, it's not a disaster either. We just continue to move the needle forward.
Yeah, I think you asked the question, it was a great question on like, there's so many external variables, and it's like there totally is, but the dream or, research hope for me is that at some point we will have high quality basketball research that has caught up to soccer, rugby, AFL, right? The quantity of research inside of elite basketball is still extremely small. Inside of that space, NBA specific research is even smaller. So for me, I think as society moves forward, as the NBA moves forward, and the Players Association and each individual player becoming more and more comfortable and interested in this data, that we're going to be able to do some really, really interesting stuff over the next 10, 15 years with, like you said, with the AI stuff. Like, who knows where we're going with some of this and what we'll be able to accomplish.
Yeah, the thought that came to my mind is two thoughts. First off, the reason I think the basketball culture is behind those other leagues you said is basketball is not the world's most popular sport, right? Mm-hmm. There's how many leagues and countries are doing research on the same sport, whereas not only are you talking about basketball being a less popular sport across the world, but even take that and say the NBA in itself is the highest quality league in the world. And then after that, I'm not a basketball player. This is not a slight. I'm just saying my understanding is if you're not in the NBA, like the leagues below that, you can't say what's the next best league after that, right? I don't think there's like a definitive tier system like you have in European soccer where you have your top 4 leagues. You kind of know what are the best leagues in the world. I don't know if that sample size is as large as the soccer and rugby space. And then
Yeah.
the other point that I had for you, I can't recall because I just got lost in that tangent. But I think we're heading in the right way. We're heading in the right direction for sure.
Yeah. And I look at it that maybe a few years ago, if we think like Dunning-Kruger effect kind of stuff, like a few years ago, we thought we knew a lot. We thought we were going the right direction. And, maybe this is just my personal journey along the Dunning-Kruger slope. Like I feel like we're, as a community, lower on that now and appreciating like how much more there is to learn and to understand and how complicated some of the questions we want answers to, like they're massive problems to deal with and understand.
Yeah, I found my point. My point is, what's going to be really fascinating, what I'm really hopeful these companies do is some of like the mainstream companies that a lot of teams across a lot of leagues are using. I hope there's an initiative on their end to look at that data and look at that research and can you help us find the norms? Because you think about it, let's just think about what's a popular thing that a lot of force plates is something a lot of teams in multiple leagues are using. It's like, man, it's just like the information you're collecting on your servers and in your cloud systems. Can you help us? Can you throw us a bone and put some information out there? And I hope those companies, if you're listening or you're an affiliate or whoever you are that may know those people, come on, put the word out there and help us down in the trenches, put together some of the larger data sets, because ultimately the larger the sample, the larger the data, the more powerful it can be. So I'm hopeful and optimistic that's where we get to with some of these tech companies having an influence on a lot of different leagues across the world.
Yeah, I think we're going there for sure. And I think there's good private groups to the external consultant thing. There's good private groups out there now that have collected some more sizable data sets on athletes across multiple sports and have worked to produce some information out there that is interesting and different than just you and I looking at 15 NBA players a year. Like I think of P3 as like the most obvious example when you say force plates of like they've got a lot of data across the country, across multiple sports, and they've put a bunch of it out there for public consumption. And I really respect that. I think doing in-house research is cool, and we got to keep some of this stuff proprietary, and if we can use that as a competitive advantage. But we all get better by making stuff available public for potential criticisms, for how can I get better, and all of us working together to go the right direction.
Oh, man, wouldn't it be nice if we all could just open our books and open our doors and just
Uh,
share these ideas? But it's a competitive advantage, right? I think that's probably
yeah.
just the nature of it. So I hear you. I love that idea. I'm optimistic we get there, but I'm not keeping my I'm not holding my breath over here.
For sure.
We spent a lot of time talking about load management, and I want to just kind of spin it briefly because I look at, it's just a continuum of care. If you think about, the world of load management, sports science, we often talk about it in the world of performance, but it's also a key component. I mean, you're a physical therapist by trade, so am I. Like that plays into what we have to do from rehab and return to play. So without diving, I don't want to spend too much more time here, but I do want to get your perspective on, you know, how your experiences in load management and sports science have influenced your processes around return to play and rehabilitation.
Yes. The first one is making sure that the data I'm collecting, I can collect in a repeatable fashion, right? I think if you're not collecting data in a reliable fashion, like it doesn't matter. Like you could have all these cool data points, but they don't mean anything. Like so, like valid and reliable markers throughout rehab, I think are really important. I view the rehab continuum very similar, I think, to you. That like I'm a PT by trade, and ACLs are always the easiest one to kind of outline this. Like early on, like it's going to be a really strong PT eval. We're looking at a very medically driven model early on of what is tissue healing, how is this progressing. You know, I think we're far enough as a community now knowing that like we can't just massively accelerate rehabs and accelerate the way the body heals without risk on the other side of it. So what are the medical considerations around that time? And then while they're in this kind of pure medical standpoint, it's not just rehab, right? They're rehab, and I think it was Charlie Weingroff did the rehab equals training, training equals rehab, and I just love it, right? It's such a win to me. In that time when they are rehabbing, say, a knee, there's no reason you can't train the contralateral limb. There's no reason you can't train upper body. There's no reason you can't do energy systems development in building this athlete so that when they get to a point, they're, still have some base of strength, some base of endurance, and some base of power. So I think there's that piece. And then I think in the mid to late stage, return to play, once they're on the court running and eventually progressing into like small sided games and full team practice, it's a lot easier to quantify what those practice demands are and then relating them back to game demands. So before it was like, oh, well, what are they going to, in soccer, what are they going to play? Oh, their first game, they're going to play 15 minutes, then they're going to go to 30, then they're going to play 45, 75, and then a full game. And it's like, yeah, but 15 minutes in that game and 15 minutes in that game could look totally different. And what are they prepared for? So I'm a big fan of like with the NBA game data, keeping like a normative set of like, here is what the athlete undergoes. Here's, one standard deviation, two standard deviations away from the norm. So if we're preparing an athlete coming through a long-term rehab, whether ACL, long-term soft tissue injury, what are we preparing them for on the high end? Gabbett kind of talks about this with his like worst case scenario. Some of the stuff that NBA groups have been doing now, right? Like stints of play and those intensity blocks. Using our workload technology to prepare athletes for that and to simulate those demands in the gym, I think gets a lot easier because of the technology we have to support us. If we get even more granular on it, and now we're getting super nerdy, right? Like if I'm looking at a hamstring, for instance, like I'm looking at top speed and I'm interested in how much time they're spending there over 85%, 90, 95% of their max speed. If I'm thinking ankle, groin, either one kind of, it's like, am I looking at acceleration and deceleration max values and the directions that they're moving, and do these match up? I think directional preference is super hard because of how chaotic the environment is, but like max acceleration exposure, I think can be really helpful of like what's happening at the ankle or the adductor. Are we in a position to push them onto the floor? Because we know the chaos in game gets higher, the nervous system's ramped up, lights, camera, action, the whole 9 yards. So I think as you get more granular, it's making workload metrics tissue specific.
Amen to that. Everything you said, I support. We do share a similar mindset in that continuing performance, the rehab side of things. But I appreciate you acknowledging the medical component, because you cannot underestimate and not acknowledge the significance of that phase, because ultimately that's the phase that's going to set you up for success down the road. So that's something that there are definitely better clinicians out there that understand that space better than I do, those that live in the clinic more than the sports space. So I definitely appreciate those that do a really good job in those scenarios when you don't have all those people in house. So to kind of wrap up this idea of sports science, return to play, load management, what do you hope our industry gets right in the next 5 years?
Yeah, I think my answer might surprise some people. I think for me, it doesn't, for our community, it doesn't necessarily relate to doing more, collecting more data, this and that. I think better alignment on organizational structure, communication channels is what's most important. Because I think about what are the biggest problems that sports teams deal with. And you would know from talking to people around the industry, and I've talked to a lot of people over the years, that everybody relates like, hey, communication is hard. It's hard to get what I mean across to a player, across to a coach, across to a front office. And then I imagine they're having those same conversations of like, hey, they just don't get it, right? Like they're not seeing it the way the front office is seeing it. So I think, better aligning ourselves with an organizational structure in patterns to how we communicate, how we build trust with players in front office, that I think is a home run. And then we can dive more into the data. Now, if we need a tech answer for the podcast and like what fits the bill, I think not just collecting data to collect data. I think give me actionable data. Give me shit that matters. You can tell me a million times all these cool stats you collected, and I'm going to ask you if it matters as far as wins, losses, injury rate, strength development, and let's get tangible outcomes over the next 5 years.
I agree. It's got to be tangible. I think there's two there's two ways to look at it. I think there's the way to look at it, the research component, like, hey, like I would love to hope we learn X about this. But then the reality is because we need results now, yesterday, and tomorrow, that the act like I think you said it great, the actionable side of it has to be at
Mm-hmm.
the forefront. But you can't you it's hard, right? Because you can't grow the actionable side of things without having the foresight to do some research or do a little bit more curious exploring of the data and ask some questions. So it's a catch 22. And I think you're starting to see with the growth of data scientists, sports scientists, performance researchers, right, helping navigate that space off of the hands of the practitioners, because you can't live in the future and you can't live in the now at the same time. You got to kind of choose which one you're going to live in, and that's where you got to grow.
Yeah, I think you absolutely. I love that you can't live in the future and the now, right? Like you've got to have people focused on one thing or the other. And I think if you're living in the now and just collecting all this data, it's really easy to get enticed by the new shiny object, but then you're just building a house of cards. Like if we have people looking into the future and helping set a foundation of what's normal, what's not normal, when do we push, why do we push, it helps us to have a strong foundation and backing what we do in high performance.
Speaking of high performance, you've been a part of some pretty cool high performance cultures, NBA, MLS, right? We've talked, you've heard it, we've had, you've been listening to this whole episode. You've noticed we said wins, losses. The premise of this show is not only to talk shop about what we do, but also, like share the experiences that we have had being a part of some of these high performance cultures, right? So the idea of, the small wins and understanding that it's not just the results on the court, right? How do we, yes, achieve those, but find our small wins along the way?
Yeah, I love this question, because I think it gets back to some of what I touched on earlier of like maintaining a little bit of perspective every day. Not getting so wrapped up in every single result, right? Because those end up being big wins. But I think small wins for me is how have I helped others on a day to day basis? And like there's days that you may not feel like you've helped an athlete just because it's the middle of an ACL rehab. It's the middle of a long term hamstring rehab. It's the middle of this. And it's like, well, you're just kind of in the grind. But like, what else can I do on that day to help somebody else or to help that athlete feel better? Can I, help them get some things together? Can I help the equipment manager unload the bus? Can I help the coaches with something that they're stressed on? Like just being an asset to others around you, I think creates those small wins. And then it's infectious when you have a really good culture of people who are helping and supportive of each other and not just thinking about how do I do my task and my task well. So that's maybe what I think of when I think of small wins.
I appreciate that. And the phrase that comes to mind, kind of the latter part of that answer, was being a good team player, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that is underappreciated in this space because you definitely recognize a good team player from a great team player, and some of those things you hit on are some of the delineation between a good and a great, or even a poor teammate. Because ultimately, I love that you took the perspective of sometimes you're in the middle of an ACL rehab and it's Groundhog Day for the next 4 weeks, right? Like that's tough, right? But the being an asset to the rest of your teammates and or the rest of the players, I think, is a huge perspective, and I just really appreciate the way you worded that because it definitely just was a little bit of like, that resonated with me really well.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's easy to get stuck in the monotony of pro sports day in day out, get grumpy and grouchy, but we're here to take care of each other. We're social beings. Like let's help each other, let's support each other, let's be positive, and yeah, that energy is infectious around a building.
I agree, and then with that being around these teams and around high achievers everywhere, right? Like there's a lot of people that don't have access to those environments, have access to those people. So I imagine you've learned some lessons or observed some really robust strategies or habits to achieve high performance, right? So if someone's looking to upgrade their own lifestyle, their performance. What advice do you have that you've gathered from your years in pro sports?
Yeah, be prepared for the grind. I think if you want to make big change to your life and successful, strong habits, that takes time to build. And there is time, like you mentioned, like the 4 weeks of an ACL, like there's times that it's grueling. Like there's times when you're starting a workout program that you don't feel like you're getting results. Every workout stinks. My body mass hasn't changed, this and that. Like there's going to be a lot of putting the work in when nobody else is watching to get the payoff down the road. It's very much a delayed gratification as far as I look at high performers, and people don't see all the work that goes into it. They just see the outcome and they want the outcome. And I'll say, like, I love helping out students, but the one line that gets me all the time is like, I'll get an email and it's like, I want to do what you do. And it's like, boy, I mean, I hope you do, right? But I don't think people always know what that means. That there's a real serious grind inside of high performance sport, inside of professional sports, watching the athletes and the coaches. Coaches in the NBA are some of the most dedicated people to the sport I've ever seen. I hear the same things about NFL coaches. Like those guys are really in the grind, and they're doing it because they love the game. So it's like, be ready for the hard moments and be ready for the grind.
Absolutely love that. Absolutely love that. It's couldn't be more true.
Yeah, it's a grind. Life is a grind, right? But you got to appreciate, like you said, appreciate those small wins inside of it.
Oh, absolutely, dude. Absolutely. Or else life wouldn't be fun. It wouldn't be fun. It
Yeah.
wouldn't be enjoyable. You got to find those joyful moments. Let's end some fun questions here, because it's always cool to get your perspective on your experience in the sport. It's also fun for people just are looking for opportunities to know what's in there besides the work. Like these are some of the other positives and perks that we get to experience. So, one question I have for you is, what is your favorite hotel you've stayed at and why?
Oh, boy, favorite hotel I've stayed at and why? I think for like the actual hotel, we were talking about it a little bit on pre-show. The Post Oak in Houston is like nothing that I would have ever experienced in my life without the NBA. I mean, that thing is so over the top and so incredible, with like a two TVs that comes out of a marble stand. Like if you do, if you were, most people will not have stayed there. Please go look this place up. It is out of control. It's in Houston. So I think just for like the wow factor, that's probably number one of just like actual hotel building. There's other locations that I certainly like better of hotels. Like I'm a big fan of hotels on the water or near running trails or near stuff that I can like be active around too.
That was my follow up question. Like, that's what defines a good hotel?
Oh yeah. I could definitely tell you what defines a bad hotel. What defines a good. We won't do it here. We won't do it live. I think what defines a good hotel for me is polite, attentive staff. I think goes a long way, right? Like I think it's just helping each other out. Having nice, polite people around puts me in a better mood, puts a smile on my face. Clean rooms, not noisy. I think rooms that are quiet are really helpful. Like we all know those hotels that like you feel like you can hear the person in the room next to you, or you feel like you can hear the elevator ding every time it goes off. That drives me, like ADD guy, if I'm trying to work on my computer, stuff drives me nuts. So that, I think location and proximity to, I love to eat. I'm a big coffee guy. So like location to good coffee shops, good restaurants, and then running on the road, I think is a great way to experience cities. So like San Francisco, for years we stayed at the St. Regis, and to be able to like go down and run by the pier and run by the baseball stadium, like it's just, those are really cool experiences to have.
I agree. Running the city or getting out for a bike ride is definitely the better way to enjoy some of these. Unfortunately, basketball season happens in the winter, so I'm envious of the MLS season and miss the summer months or the baseball
Yeah.
seasons that are in the summer months. But that's neither here nor there. I appreciate that. How about the best book you've read in the last 2 years?
Yeah, this is a really tough question. So I would say, unfortunately for me, I haven't done as much personal reading as I would like, but the one that came to mind when you said it was Adam Grant's The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know. And I think it's just so reflective of what we've kind of spent the last bit of time talking about like staying curious in life and keeping that at the forefront. For me, it's something that I think is really important. It's like getting lost in the process, staying curious. Are things that I'm not going to pretend that I have figured out, but are things that I strive to be better at on a regular basis.
Amen to that. I think I go back to this phrase time and time again. If you live life more curiously, you'd just be so better off.
Yeah.
We're too quick to assume or too quick to pass judgment, but curiosity tends to lend itself to be a bit more enjoyable.
Yeah.
How about last one I have for you is what's one experience you've had in sports that was eye opening or gave you a new experience that you didn't, new perspective that you didn't have?
Yeah, this is another like some of the. I guess we started on a really personal, kind of the emotional journey around pro sports, and we'll finish there as well. For me, I can say like the one thing that had the biggest impact on me, both professionally and personally, was spending 83 days in the bubble. The year we went to the COVID year, going to the Western Conference Finals. You learn a lot about yourself when you're on a hotel floor with 30 of your closest coworkers and an 8-foot fence that you can't leave without a 2-week quarantine in your room. So that experience kind of during that time really solidified for me like the importance of my wife and my dogs at the time and now my son. And in this moment, fast forward 3 years where I've got time and significantly more freedom to experience this. I have a healthier perspective to how valuable this time really is. So I'd say the time in the bubble was really challenging, but a really good perspective shifter going forward.
Absolutely. The bubble was a one of life's greatest experiments and greatest experiences that I hope no one else has to experience in the next century or two. Don't get me wrong. Like there was days I'm sure you felt the same as like, get me out of here. Like I think of,
Yeah.
you an Adam Sandler fan.
Yes, big Adam Sandler fan.
I think of there was days where it's Happy Gilmore and it's the nursery and that lady like jumps on the car is like, get me out of here. Like that's the visual. That's the visual I want to paint for everyone. Is what sometimes the bubble felt like, and we're just going to end on that visual because I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, I feel every bit of that to my core, especially like I've mentioned my family. My wife and I are best friends, so to like just not be around each other for 3 months was really challenging. I was on the get me out of here train by the end of it.
Oh man, this was great. I this filled all the expectations I had, and it's just great to catch up with you. The one thing I want to leave the audience with is if they're looking to get in contact with you or just learn more about your PhD work, how can they reach out to you?
Yeah, so my Instagram and my Twitter are both Doc Tuttle DPT. I'm not super active. I need to be more active because I want to make sure that the work I'm trying to do gets out there. So hopefully there's some stuff coming, but you can totally reach out to me on there, shoot me a message, get in touch. I try and respond to anything that I get. Please don't start your message with "I want to do what you do." That makes it harder. So yeah, that's probably the best way to reach out or stay in touch. Yeah, and then as papers start coming out, I'll make sure to put them up there. And then if people need copies of them, as always, you can kind of reach out and find authors that'll share those with you. So that's the way. And then, back onto the pro sports grind at some point here.
All right, I hope you get there sooner rather than later, man. I'm looking forward to the PhD work.
Awesome. I appreciate it. Thanks for the time.
All right, man. Likewise.